Carlos Castaneda's A Separate Reality, Part 1, The Preliminaries of Seeing, Chapter 3. On June 10th, 1968, I started on a long journey with Don Juan to participate in I've never heard this word said, but I've said it in my head many a time, so this is the way I say it, a mitote. I had been waiting for this opportunity for months, yet I was not really sure I wanted to go. I thought my hesitation was due to my fear that at a peyote meeting I would have to ingest peyote, and I had no intention whatsoever of doing that. I had repeatedly expressed those feelings to Don Juan. He laughed patiently at first, but finally he firmly stated that he did not want to hear one more thing about my fear. As far as I was concerned, a mitote was ideal ground for me to verify my schemata I had constructed. For one thing, I had never completely abandoned the idea that a covert leader was necessary at such a meeting in order to ensure agreement among the participants. Somehow I had the feeling that Don Juan had discarded my idea for reasons of his own, since he deemed it more efficacious to explain everything that took place at a mitote in terms of seeing. I thought that my interest in finding a suitable explanation in my own terms was not in accordance with what he himself wanted me to do. Therefore, he had to discard my rationale, as he was accustomed to doing, for whatever did not conform to his system. Right before we started on the journey, Don Juan eased my apprehension about having to ingest peyote by telling me that I was attending the meeting only to watch. I felt elated. At that time, I was almost certain I was going to discover the covert procedure by which the participants arrive at an agreement. It was late afternoon when we left. The sun was almost on the horizon. I felt it on my neck and wished I had a Venetian blind in the rear window of my car. From the top of the hill I could see down into a huge valley, and the road was like a black ribbon laid flat over the ground, up and down innumerable hills. I followed it with my eyes for a moment before we began descending. It ran due south until it disappeared over a range of low mountains in the distance. Don Juan sat quietly, looking straight ahead. He had not said a word for a long time. It was uncomfortably warm inside the car. I had opened all the windows, but that did not seem to help because it was an extremely hot day. I felt very annoyed and restless. I began to complain about the heat. Don Juan frowned and looked at me quizzically. "It's hot all over Mexico this time of year," he said. "There is nothing one can do about it." I did not look at him, but I knew he was gazing at me. The car picked up speed going down the slope. I vaguely saw a highway sign, Vado, dip. When I actually saw the dip, I was going quite fast, and although I did slow down, we still felt the impact and bobbed up and down on the seats. I reduced the speed considerably. We were going through an area where livestock grazed freely on the sides of the road, an area where the carcasses of a horse or a cow run down by a car was a common sight. At a certain point, I had to stop completely and let some horses cross the highway. I was getting more restless and annoyed. I told Don Juan that it was the heat. I said that I had always disliked the heat since my childhood, because every summer I used to feel suffocated and I could hardly breathe. "You're not a child now," he said. "The heat still suffocates me." "Well, hunger used to suffocate me when I was a child," he said softly. "To be very hungry was the only thing I knew as a child, and I used to swell up until I could not breathe either. But that was when I was a child. I cannot suffocate now, and neither can I swell up like a toad when I am hungry." I did not know what to say. I felt I was getting myself into an untenable position, and soon I would have to defend a point I really didn't care to defend. The heat was not that bad. What disturbed me was the prospect of driving over 1,000 miles to our destination. I felt annoyed at the thought of having to exert myself. "Let's stop and get something to eat," I said. "Maybe it won't be so hot once the sun goes down." Don Juan looked at me smiling and said that there were not any clean towns for a long stretch, and that he had understood my policy was to not eat from the stands on the roadside. "Don't you fear diarrhea anymore?" he asked. I knew he was being sarcastic, yet he kept an inquisitive and at the same time serious look on his face. "The way you act," he said, "one would think that diarrhea is lurking out there, waiting for you to step out of the car you jump you. You're in a terrific fix. If you escape the heat, diarrhea will eventually get you." Don Juan's tone was so serious that I began to laugh. Then he drove in silence for a long time. When we arrived at a highway stop for trucks called Los Vidros, glass, it was already quite dark. Don Juan shouted from the car, "What do you have to eat today?" "Pork meat," a woman shouted back from inside. "I hope for your sake that the pig was run down on the road today," Don Juan said to me, laughing. We got out of the car. The road was flanked on both sides by ranges of low mountains that seemed to be solidified lava from some gigantic volcanic eruption. In the darkness of the black, jagged peaks were silhouetted against the sky like a huge menacing walls of glass slivers. While we ate, I told Don Juan that I could see the reason why the place was called Glass. I said that to me the name was obviously due to the glass sliver shape of the mountains. Don Juan said in a convincing tone that the place was called Los Vidros because a truck loaded with glass had overturned on that spot and the glass shreds were left lying around the road for years. I felt he was being facetious and asked him to tell me if that was the real reason. "Why don't you go ask someone?" he said. I asked the man who was sitting at a table next to ours. He said apologetically that he didn't know. I went into the kitchen and asked the woman there if they knew. They all said they didn't, that the place was just called Glass. "I believe I'm right," Don Juan said in a low voice. "Mexicans are not given to noticing things around them. I'm sure they can't see the glass mountains, but they surely can leave a mountain of glass shreds lying around for years." We both found the image funny and laughed. When we had finished eating, Don Juan asked me how I felt. I told him fine, but I really felt somewhat queasy. Don Juan gave me a steadfast look and seemed to detect my feelings of discomfort. "Once you decided to come to Mexico, you should have put all your petty fears away," he said very sternly. "Your decision to come should have vanquished them. You came because you wanted to come. That's the warrior's way. I have told you time and time again, the most effective way to live is as a warrior. Worry and think before you make any decision. But once you make it, be on your way free from worries and thoughts. There will be a million other decisions still awaiting you. That's the warrior's way." I believe I do that, Don Juan, at least some of the time. It's very hard to keep on reminding myself, though. A warrior thinks of his death when things become unclear. That's even harder, Don Juan. For most people, death is very vague and remote. We never think of it. Why not? Why should we? Very simply said, because the idea of death is the only thing that tempers our spirit. By the time we left Los Vidros, it was so dark that the jagged silhouettes of the mountains had emerged into the darkness of the sky. We drove in silence for more than an hour. I felt tired. It was as though I didn't want to talk because there was nothing to talk about. The traffic was minimal. Few cars passed by from the opposite direction. It seemed as if we were the only people going south on the highway. I thought that was strange, and I kept on looking in the rearview mirror to see if there were other cars coming from behind, but there were none. After a while, I stopped looking for cars and began to dwell again on the prospect of our trip. Then I noticed that my headlights seemed extremely bright in contrast with the darkness all around, and I looked again in the rearview mirror. I saw a bright glare first, and then 2 points of light that seemed to have emerged from the ground. They were the headlights of a car on a hilltop in the distance behind us. They remained visible for a while, then they disappeared into the darkness, as if they had been scooped away. After a moment, they appeared on another hilltop, and then they disappeared again. I followed their appearances and disappearances in the mirror for a long time. At one point, it occurred to me that the car was gaining on us. It was definitely closing in. The lights were bigger and brighter. I deliberately stepped on the gas pedal. I had a sensation of uneasiness. Don Juan seemed to take notice of my concern, or perhaps he was only noticing that I was speeding up. He looked at me first, then he turned around and looked at the distant headlights. Excuse me. He asked me if there was something wrong with me. I told him that I had not seen any cars behind us for hours, and then suddenly I noticed the lights of a car that seemed to be gaining on us all the time. He chuckled and asked me if I really thought it was a car. I told him that it had to be a car, and he said that my concern revealed to him that somehow I must have felt that whatever was behind us was something more than a mere car. I insisted I thought that it was just another car on the highway, or perhaps a truck. "What else can it be?" I said loudly. Don Juan's probing had put me on the edge. He turned and looked straight at me and nodded slowly as if measuring what he was going to say. "Those are the lights of the head. Those are the lights on the head of Death," he said softly. "Death put them on like a hat and then shoots off on a gallop. Those are the lights of Death on the gallop, gaining on us, getting closer and closer." A chill ran up my back. After a while, I looked in the rearview mirror again, and the lights were not there anymore. I told Don Juan that the car must have stopped or turned off the road. He did not look back. He just stretched his arms and yawned. "No," he said, "Death never stops. Sometimes it turns off its lights, that's all." We arrived in northeastern Mexico on June 13th. Two old women who looked alike and seemed to be... Oh, Jesus Christ. And where are we here? We arrived in northeast Mexico June 13th. Two old women who looked alike and seemed to be sisters, and 4 girls were gathered at the door of a small adobe house. There was a hut behind the house and a dilapidated barn that had only part of its roof and one wall left. The women were apparently waiting for us. They must have spotted my car by the dust it raised on the dirt after I left the paved highway a couple of miles away. The house was in a deep valley, and viewed from the door, the highway looked like a long scar high up on the side of the green hills. Don Juan got out of the car and talked with the old women for a moment. They pointed to some wooden stools in front of the door. Don Juan signaled me to come over and sit down. One of the old women sat with us. The rest went inside the house. 2 of the girls remained by the door, examining me with curiosity. I waved at them. They giggled and ran inside. After a few minutes, 2 young men came over and greeted Don Juan. They did not speak to me or even look at me. They talked to Don Juan briefly. Then he got up, and all of us, including the women, walked to another house, perhaps a half a mile away. We met there with another group of people. Don Juan went inside, but he told me to stay by the door. I looked in and saw an old Indian man around Don Juan's age sitting on a wooden stool. It was not quite dark. A group of young Indian men and women were standing quietly around an old truck parked in front of the house. I talked to them in Spanish, but they deliberately avoided answering me. The women giggled every time I said something, and the men smiled politely and turned their eyes away. It was as if they did not understand me, yet I was sure all of them spoke Spanish, because I had heard them talking among themselves. After a while, Don Juan and the other old man came out and got into the truck and sat next to the driver. That appeared to be a signal for everyone to climb onto the flatbed of the truck. There were no side railings, and when the truck began to move, we all hung on to a long rope that was tied from some hooks on the chassis. The truck moved slowly on the dirt road. At one point, on a very steep slope, it stopped and everybody jumped down and walked again, and then the two young men hopped onto the flatbed again and sat on the edge without using the rope. The woman laughed and encouraged them to maintain their precarious position. Don Juan and the old man, who was referred to as Don Silvio, walked together and did not seem to be concerned with the young men's histrionics. When the road leveled off, everybody got back on the truck. We rode for about an hour. The floor was extremely hard and uncomfortable, so I stood up and held on to the front of the cab and rode that way until we stopped in front of a group of shacks. There were more people there. It was very dark by then, and I could see only a few of them in the dim yellowish light of the kerosene lanterns that hung by an open door. Everybody got off the truck and mingled with the people in the houses. Don Juan told me again to stay outside. I leaned against the front fender of the truck, and after a minute or two I was joined by three young men. I had met one of them 4 years before at a previous mitote. He embraced me by grabbing my forearms. "You're fine," he whispered to me in Spanish. We stayed very quietly by the truck. It was a warm, windy night. I could hear the soft rumble of a stream close by. My friend asked me in a whisper if I had any cigarettes. I passed the pack around. By the glow of the cigarettes, I looked at my watch. It was 9 o'clock. A group of people emerged from inside the house soon afterwards, and the three young men walked away. Don Juan came over to me and told me he had explained my presence to everybody's satisfaction, and that I was welcome to come and serve water at the mitote. He said we would be going right away. A group of 10 women and 11 men left the house. The man heading the party was rather husky. He was perhaps in his mid-50s. They called him Moco, a nickname which meant crop. He moved with brisk, firm steps. He carried a kerosene lantern and waved it from side to side as we walked. At first, I thought he was moving it at random, but then I discovered that he waved the lantern to mark an obstacle or a difficult pass on the road. We walked for over an hour. The women chatted and laughed softly from time to time. Don Juan and the other old man were at the head of the line. I was at the very tail end of it. I kept my eyes down on the road, trying to see where I was walking. It had been 4 years since Don Juan and I had been in the hills at night, and I had lost a great deal of physical prowess. I kept stumbling and involuntarily kicked small rocks. My knees did not have any flexibility. The road seemed to come up at me, and when I encountered a high spot, or it seemed to give under me when I hit a low spot. I was the noisiest walker, and it made me into an unwilling clown. Someone in the group said, "Woo," every time I stumbled, and everyone laughed. At one point, one of the rocks I kicked hit a woman's heel, and she said out loud to everyone's delight, "Give a candle to that poor boy." But the final mortification was when I tripped and had to hold on to the person in front of me. He nearly lost his balance with my weight on him and let out a deliberate scream that was out of all proportion. Everyone laughed so hard that the whole group had to stop for a while. At a certain moment, the man who was leading jerked his lantern up and down. It seemed that the sign we had arrived at our destination. There was a dark silhouette of a low house to my right, a short distance away. Everyone in the group scrambled in different directions. I looked for Don Juan. It was difficult to find him in the darkness. I stumbled noisily for a while before noticing that he was sitting on a rock. He again told me that my duty was to bring water for the men who were going to participate. He had taught me the procedure years before. I remembered every detail of it, but he insisted on refreshing my memory and showed me again how to do it. Afterwards, we walked to the back of the house where all the men were gathered. They had built a fire. There was a cleared area with straw mats perhaps 15 feet away from the fire. Moko, the man who had led us, sat on a mat first. I noticed that the upper edge of his left ear was missing, which accounted for his nickname. Don Silvio sat to his right and Don Juan to his left. Moko was sitting facing the fire. A young man advanced toward me and placed a placed a flat basket with peyote buttons in front of him. Then the young man sat down between Moko and Don Silvio. Another young man carried 2 small baskets and placed them next to the peyote buttons, and then sat between Moko and Don Juan. Then 2 other young men flanked Don Silvio and Don Juan, closing a circle of 7 persons. The women remained inside the house. 2 young men were in charge of keeping the fire burning all night, and 1 teenager and I kept the water that was going to be given to the 7 participants after the all-night ritual. The boy and I sat by a rock. The fire and the receptacle with water were opposite each other and at an equal distance from the circle of participants. Moko, the headman, sang his peyote song. His eyes were closed. His body bobbed up and down. It was a very long song. I did not understand the language. Then all of them, one by one, sang their peyote song. They did not seem to follow any preconceived order. They apparently sang whenever they felt like doing it. Then Moko held the basket with peyote buttons, took 2 of them, and placed it back again in the center of the circle. Don Silvio was next, and then Don Juan. The 4 young men, who seemed to be a separate unit, took 2 peyote buttons each, following a counterclockwise direction. Each of the 7 participants sang and ate 2 peyote buttons 4 consecutive times. Then they passed the other 2 baskets, which contained dried fruit and meat. They repeated this cycle at various times during the night, yet I could not detect any underlying order to their individual movements. They did not speak to one another. They seemed rather to be by themselves and to themselves. I did not see any of them, not even once, paying attention to what the other men were doing. Before daybreak, they got up, and the young man and I gave them water. Afterwards, I walked around to orientate myself. The house was a one-room shack, of low adobe construction with a thatched roof. The scenery that surrounded it was quite oppressive. The shack was located in a harsh plain with mixed vegetation. Shrubs and cacti grew together, but there were no trees at all. I did not like the feel of venturing beyond the house. The women left during the morning. The men moved silently in the area immediately surrounding the house. Around midday, all of us sat down again in the same order we had sat down the night before. A basket with pieces of dried meat cut to the same size as peyote buttons was passed around. Some of the men sang their peyote song. After an hour or so, all of them stood up and went off in different directions. The woman had left a pot of gruel by the fire and water attendants. I ate some of it, and I slept most of the afternoon. After dark, the young men in charge of the fire built another one, and the cycle of intake of peyote buttons began again. It followed roughly the same order as the preceding night, ending at daybreak. During the course of the night, I struggled to observe and recorded every single movement performed by each of the 7 participants, in hopes of discovering the slightest form of a detectable system of verbal or nonverbal communication among them. There was nothing in their actions, however, that revealed any underlying system. In the early evening, the cycle of intake of peyote was renewed. By morning, I knew that I had completely failed to find clues that would point out the covert leader, or to discover any form of covert communication among them, or any traces of their system of agreement. For the rest of the day, I sat by myself and tried to arrange my notes. When the men gathered again for the fourth night, I knew somehow that this was to be the last meeting. Nobody had mentioned anything about it to me, yet I knew they would disband the next day. I sat by the water again, and everyone else resumed his position in the order that had already been established. The behavior of the 7 men in the circle was a replica of what I had observed during the 3 previous nights. I became absorbed in their movements as I had done before. I wanted to record everything they did, every movement, every utterance, every gesture. At a certain moment, I heard a sort of beep in my ear. It was a common sort of buzzing in the ear, and I did not pay attention to it. The beat became louder, yet it was still within the range of my ordinary bodily sensations. I remembered dividing my attention between watching the men and listening to the buzzing I was hearing. Then at a given instant, the faces of the men seemed to become brighter. It was as if a light had been turned on. It was not quite like an electric light or a lantern, or the reflection of the fire on their faces. It was rather an iridescence, a pink luminosity, a very tenuous yet detectable from where I was. The buzzing seemed to increase. I looked at the teenage boy who was with me, but he had fallen asleep. The pink luminosity became more noticeable by then. I looked at Don Juan's eyes. His eyes were closed, and so were Don Silvio's, and so were Moco's. I could not see the eyes of the 4 younger men because 2 of them were bent forward and the other 2 had their backs turned to me. I became even more involved in watching, yet I had not fully realized that I was actually hearing a buzzing, and I was actually seeing a pinkish glow hovering over the men. After a moment, I became aware that the tenuous pink light and the buzzing were very steady. I had a moment of intense bewilderment, and then a thought crossed my mind, a thought that had nothing to do with the scene I was witnessing, nor with the purpose I had in mind for being there. I remembered something my mother had once told me when I was a child. The thought was distracting and very, very inappropriate. I tried to discard it and involve myself again in the assiduous watching, but I could not do it. The thought reoccurred. It was stronger, more demanding, and then I clearly heard my mother's voice calling me. I heard the shuffling of her slippers, and then her laughter. I turned around looking for her. I conceived that I was going to be transported in time by some sort of hallucination or mirage, and I was going to see her. But I saw only the boy sleeping beside me. To see him jolted me, and I experienced a brief moment of ease, of sobriety. I looked again at the group of men. They had not changed their position at all. However, the luminosity was gone, and so was the buzzing in my ears. I felt relieved. I thought that the hallucination of hearing my mother's voice was over. Her voice had been so clear and vivid. I said to myself over and over that for an instant the voice had almost trapped me. I noticed vaguely that Don Juan was looking at me, but that did not matter. It was the memory of my mother's voice calling me that was mesmerizing. I struggled desperately to think about something else, and then I heard her voice again, as clearly as if she had been behind me. She called my name. I turned quickly, but all I saw was the dark silhouette of the shack and the shrubs behind it. Hearing my name caused me the most profound anguish. I whined involuntarily. I felt cold and very lonely and began to weep. At that moment, I had the sensation that I needed someone to care for me. I turned my head to look at Don Juan. He was staring at me. I did not want to see him, so I closed my eyes. And then I saw my mother. It was not The thought of my mother, the way I think of her ordinarily. This was a clear vision of her, standing by me. I felt desperate. I was trembling and wanted to escape. The vision of my mother was so disturbing, too alien to what I was pursuing in that peyote meeting. There was apparently no conscious way to avoid it. Perhaps I could have opened my eyes if I really wanted the vision to vanish, but instead I examined it in detail. My examination was more than merely looking at her. I was compulsively scrutinizing and assessing. A very peculiar feeling enveloped me, as if as if it were an outside force. And I suddenly felt the horrendous burden of my mother's love. When I heard my name, I was torn apart. The memory of my mother filled me with anguish and melancholy. But when I examined her, I knew that I had never liked her. This was a shocking realization. Thoughts and images came to me as an avalanche. The vision of my mother must have vanished in the meantime. It was no longer important. I was no longer interested in what the Indians were doing either. In fact, I had forgotten the mitote. I was absorbed in a series of extraordinary thoughts. Extraordinary because they were more than thoughts. These were complete units of feeling that were emotional certainties, indisputable evidences about the nature of my relationship with my mother. At a certain moment, these extraordinary thoughts ceased to come. I noticed that they had lost their fluidity and their quality of being complete units of feeling. I had begun to think about other things. My mind was rambling. I thought about other members of my immediate family, but there were no images to accompany my thoughts. Then I looked at Don Juan. He was standing. The rest of the men were also standing. And then they all walked toward the water. I moved aside and nudged the boy who was still asleep. I related to Don Juan the sequence of my astounding vision, almost as soon as he got into my car. He laughed with great delight and said that my vision was a sign, an omen as important as my first experience with Mescalito. I remembered that Don Juan had interpreted the reactions I had when I first ingested peyote as an all-important omen. In fact, he decided to teach me his knowledge because of it. Don Juan said that during the last night of the mitote, Mescalito had hovered over me so obviously that everyone was forced to turn toward me, and that was why he was staring at me when I looked at him. I wanted to hear his interpretation of my vision, but he did not want to talk about it. He said that whatever I had experienced was nonsense in comparison to the omen. Don Juan kept on talking about Mescalito's light hovering over me and how everyone had seen it. That was really something, he said. I couldn't possibly ask for a better omen. Don Juan and I were obviously on two different avenues of thought. He was concerned with the importance of the events he had interpreted as an omen, and I was obsessed with the details of the vision I had had. I don't care about the omens, I said. I want to know what happened to me. He frowned as if he were upset and remained very stiff and quiet for a moment. Then he looked at me. His tone was very forceful. He said that the only important issue was that Mescalito had been very gentle with me and had engulfed me with his light and had given me a lesson with no effort on my part at all. End of chapter.